Bradford, West Yorkshire, the 4th of March, 1944, a little after 6 in the evening. Tommy Vale, 15 years old, 4 months into the job, stood at the gate of number 11 Undercliff Terrace with a telegram in his right hand and his GPO bicycle propped against the wall behind him. He had collected it from the Central Telegraph Office 20 minutes earlier, one of 6 waiting to go out that evening, and he had been told only the address and the time it had been handed in, never what it said. Number 11 had a son at war. Corporal Walter Redfern, 8th Army, last known somewhere north of Rome. Tommy knew the form in his hand was an ordinary telegram. Not one of the illustrated greetings forms the office kept for birthdays and weddings. And that told him something, the way it told every messenger something, though it told him nothing for certain. He had walked this path before, twice, with 2 different telegrams for 2 different houses on this same street, and both times it had been good news. He did not know, yet, what this one was. He raised his hand to the door. Before he could knock, the curtain in the front room moved. Mrs. Redfern had been watching for the bicycle since 5:30, the way she had watched every evening since the telegram about Walter's transfer had come in January. That one had been good news, promotion to corporal, and the way half the street watched, one way or another, for the boy on the red bicycle with the leather pouch, because in March 1944 there was hardly a house between Undercliff Terrace and Otley Road that did not have a son, husband, or brother somewhere the ordinary post could not easily reach, and the telegram was the only channel fast enough to carry news that could not wait for the letter. Tommy Vale did not know what the Redferns had been through in the 4 months since Walter left, or in the 4 years before that since the war began. He knew what the General Post Office had trained him to know: the address, the delivery time, the correct form of words if asked for the sender's office. What he was about to hand across this doorstep was not, to him, a mystery to be solved. It was a telegram, delivered on schedule, the 90th or so he had carried since October. To the woman opening the door, it was the only thing in the world. What did 15-year-old Tommy Vale actually know about the telegram in his hand? And what did the General Post Office, which had turned boys like him into a uniformed, disciplined delivery service 74 years earlier, expect him to know and not to know about what he carried? To understand what the General Post Office expected of Tommy Vale, you need to understand what the telegram messenger service had been built to be since 1870, the year the Post Office took over Britain's inland telegraph network from the railway companies and the private telegraph firms that had run it before. The service did not want an errand boy. It wanted something closer to a junior, uniformed civil servant, and it wrote the expectation down. In London, every messenger was required to carry a small blue book of instructions at all times, and to produce it whenever an inspector asked. The rules covered appearance, hair kept short, uniform kept clean, and conduct. No smoking, gambling, or card playing while in uniform, no sliding down banister rails between floors, courtesy to everyone regardless of the message. Between 1915 and 1921, a daily drill was added to the messenger's morning routine, on top of the walking or cycling round itself. A messenger caught breaking the rules risked the uniform being taken away from him, and the uniform was the job. Tommy Vale had been issued his own uniform, his pouch belt, and a waterproof cape at the store's counter of the Bradford office in October 1943, measured on the spot by an inspector who logged the fitting before Tommy had delivered a single telegram. He would keep the job and the wage that came with it until he turned 19, at which point, if he stayed with the post office, he would be moved up to postman and given letters and parcels to carry instead of telegrams. Until then, he was one of several thousand boys across Britain wearing a uniform built on a rulebook nearly as old as the service itself, riding a bicycle whose panniers carried, on any given evening, both a wedding congratulations and a death. What the rulebook could not do was tell a 15-year-old what to feel, or show, standing at a gate with a plain telegram form in his hand and a mother's face already changing in the doorway. So if the rulebook governed his hair, his conduct, and his hours, what did 4 months on this round teach Tommy Vale that no blue book of instructions ever could? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Royal Mail, between 1,900 and 1,980. The vehicle, the round, the sorting office, and the letter that the system carried. Not nostalgia for red vans. The documented operational reality of a postal system and the specific human meaning of what it delivered before the telephone changed what it meant to wait for news. Even without a telegram in the family, most people can still picture it. A knock that arrives faster than the post ever could, and a few seconds on the doorstep before anyone knows if it's good news or bad. And if you remember these telegrams, put it in the comments. If you remember a telegram arriving at your family's door, good news or bad. Or if you ever waited behind a curtain to see whether the messenger's bicycle turned in at your gate, tell us what you remember about the moment before it was opened. Next, the returned letter branch, where the post office kept every letter that had nowhere left to go. Back on the round, what 4 months on the Bradford round had taught Tommy Vale was not written in any blue book. It was the specific geography of dread that existed on his patch of the city in the spring of 1944. Which streets had sent sons to North Africa, which to Burma, which to the merchant navy convoys in the Atlantic, and which houses, like the Redferns, were currently in a stretch of waiting with no news at all, the kind of waiting that made an ordinary knock at the door feel like an event before anyone had said a word. Before you can understand what that geography meant, you need to understand what a telegram was for in 1944 and what it was not for. A telegram was priced by the word deliberately. To keep casual use low, a device meant for news that genuinely could not wait for the next post. A birth, a death, an urgent piece of business, and, across 2 world wars, exactly the category of news every household with someone away was braced to receive. A letter took days. A telegram took hours, sometimes less. For a family with a son at the front, the telegram was not one channel among several. For long stretches, it was the only channel fast enough to matter. Tommy did not need an office memo to tell him which houses on Undercliff Terrace fell into that category. He had walked the street enough evenings to know it without being told. Which curtains twitched at the sound of a bicycle bell, which mothers came to the window before he reached the gate, which houses had gone quiet in a specific way since a particular date. He had also learned, the way every messenger on a residential round eventually learned, that his own pace and posture told the household something before the envelope did, that people watched how fast he was walking, whether he looked at the house number twice, whether he hesitated at the gate, and that none of it was reliable, and all of it was watched anyway, because there was nothing else to read in the seconds before the knock. What, then, did the specific form of that telegram, the words a messenger was never told, the words the post office itself controlled and shortened before they ever reached a house like the Redferns, actually permit a wartime family to know, and what did it deliberately keep from them? The telegram form itself was plain. A printed form with blank lines for the message. No decoration. Unlike the illustrated greetings telegrams the post office sold for weddings, birthdays, and congratulations, which used artistically designed forms and cost extra, specifically because they were meant to be kept. An ordinary telegram, the kind Tommy carried to Undercliff Terrace that evening, was never designed to be kept. It was designed to be read once, understood immediately, and acted on. Every word past the minimum cost the sender money, so an ordinary telegram said only what it had to say, in the fewest words that would do it. That brevity was, historically, part of what made a telegram so hard to receive. Families across Britain in both world wars learned to dread the specific rhythm of a telegram delivered out of sequence. Not the postman's regular round at a fixed hour, but an unscheduled knock at any hour. from a messenger on a bicycle or, later, a motorcycle. Museum and archive holdings from the period record the same pattern repeatedly. A family receiving one telegram reporting a soldier wounded, and a second, sometimes weeks later, confirming his death. Two separate knocks, two separate waits, because the telegraph service reported what the War Office knew at the time it was known, not what a family might have preferred to receive all at once. None of that told Tommy Vale, standing at the Redferns gate, whether the telegram in his hand that evening was of that kind. He had learned, by March 1944, not to guess. Guessing was not part of the job, and it was not, he had found, something a 15-year-old could sustain, evening after evening, without it costing him something. What he did instead, what every messenger on a residential wartime round eventually did, was hand the telegram across cleanly, wait the required moment in case a reply was needed, and go back to his bicycle without watching the door close behind him. What was Tommy Vale not watching? On purpose, every time he turned back to his bicycle. And what did the post office's own internal timing system, the 2 minutes allotted for every telegram on a messenger's round, actually reveal about how the service measured a job that could not, in truth, be measured in minutes? Inside the Central Telegraph Office that evening, the system that had sent Tommy Vale out with the Redferns telegram was running on a documented, almost mechanical logic. Postal Museum records of telegram delivery rooms describe an inspector at a corner desk whose job was to send messengers out on their rounds and calculate how long each round should take. An allotted time to reach the farthest address on the round, plus 2 minutes for every additional telegram the same messenger carried on the same trip. A second inspector booked messengers back in, logged their return time against the time they had been sent out, and decided when each boy was due his meal break. The telegram itself had been received by wire, transcribed by a telegraphist, a role staffed in large numbers by women since the 1890s, when the Central Telegraph Office in London alone employed several hundred of them, and handed to the delivery room to be assigned to whichever messenger was free. None of that machinery cared, or was built to care, what was inside any specific telegram. It cared about volume, about the number of telegrams a messenger could carry on one trip without exceeding his allotted time, about whether a 15-year-old on a bicycle in wartime Bradford could get from the Central Telegraph Office to Undercliff Terrace, and back inside the window the inspector's ledger expected. The post office had built an efficient, well-documented, quietly ruthless system for moving urgent words from a sender to a recipient's door as fast as bicycle or motorcycle could manage it. It had not built, and had never claimed to build, a system for managing what happened in the 3 or 4 seconds after the door opened. That gap between what the post office measured and what actually happened on the doorstep was where the telegram messenger's job actually lived, whatever the ledger said his job was. If the system that trained, uniformed, and timed a telegram messenger was built entirely around a bicycle and a stopwatch, what changed for a boy like Tommy Vale when the General Post Office, over the following 2 decades, put him on a motorcycle instead? The bicycle Tommy Vale rode in March 1944 was, by the standards of the telegram service, already old technology. The General Post Office had first put solo motorcycles into telegram delivery in 1933, when 12 BSA 249cc machines went into service in Leeds, 20 miles from Undercliff Terrace, ridden by young men of 17 and 18, old enough for a license, but still within the messenger age range. The experiment worked well enough that it spread quickly to London and other cities. By September 1938, the post office had 465 BSA 249cc solo motorcycles in service nationally for telegram delivery, all painted in the distinctive livery that had become, by then, instantly recognizable on British streets. The war slowed the fleet's expansion but did not stop it, and it was in the years immediately after the war that the telegram motorcycle took the shape most people who remember it would recognize. In December 1948, the post office began purchasing the BSA Bantam, a light 125cc two-stroke machine. The first batch registered and put straight into telegram service. Over the machine's life with the GPO, the service purchased more than 6,500 Bantams in a range of models, and the Bantam became the standard telegram delivery motorcycle for the best part of the following 2 decades, only gradually superseded by lighter Raleigh and Pooch mopeds in later years. What the motorcycle changed, for a messenger, was range. A bicycle round covered the streets within comfortable pedaling distance of the telegraph office. A motorcycle round could reach the edge of a town, or a village on its outskirts, in the time a bicycle would still be crossing the town's centre, which mattered enormously for anything urgent, and mattered just as much, in a different way, for the geography of dread that a messenger carried with him. A motorcycle messenger covered more streets, more households, more of the specific knowledge that came with delivering urgent news to the same expanding patch of a city or county. Decade after decade, boy after boy, as one messenger turned 19 and moved up to postman, and the next one, measured for his uniform at the same store's counter, took over the same round. If motorization let the telegram messenger cover more ground and reach more households, what happened to the messenger service itself during the 2 periods when there were, quite suddenly, not enough boys available to do the job at all? Twice in the 20th century, the answer to that question was the same. Girls took over the delivery of telegrams because the boys who would ordinarily have done it were either at the front themselves or old enough to have been called up alongside the men. During the First World War, and again during the Second, girls were for the first time given some of the delivery duties that had previously belonged exclusively to boys. Issued a uniform adapted from the standard women's post office dress, with the same belt and telegram pouch the boys carried, though period accounts record local complaints that the girls had not been given adequate waterproof protection against the rain, and that some had to supply their own blouses. It is worth being precise about what this meant, because it is easy to flatten into a single sentimental line about wartime women stepping up. What it actually meant, on the ground, in a city like Bradford or Leeds, in 1917 or 1943, was that the same job, the same rulebook, the same inspector's timing formula, the same bicycle, or, later, the same bantam, was now being carried out by a 15 or 16-year-old girl instead of a boy, delivering the same category of telegram to the same kind of household, in the same uniform the rulebook had always described, adjusted only as far as it strictly had to be. The war did not soften what a telegram messenger's round required. It simply proved that the round did not, in fact, require a boy, specifically, only someone young, disciplined, and willing to knock on a door without knowing what was behind it. Tommy Vale's own round in Bradford had, in fact, been worked for the previous 18 months by a girl messenger roughly his own age, before she moved on to war work in a local mill. One of many such handovers recorded. In general terms, in post office wartime staffing patterns across British cities, as boys reached call-up age and girls stepped into rounds that had been closed to them a few years earlier. So if the round itself did not care whether a boy or a girl walked it, what did the households on Undercliff Terrace actually see and feel when the messenger reached their gate? And what changed for those same households in the 2 decades after the war? Once the telephone began to arrive in ordinary front halls, the change did not happen quickly. And it did not happen because the telegram service failed at its job. It happened because a faster, cheaper alternative gradually became available in the homes. The telegram had always had to reach by bicycle or motorcycle. Household telephone ownership in Britain spread steadily through the 1950s and 1960s and reached the great majority of homes by the 1970s. And every telephone installed in a street like Undercliff Terrace was, from the post office's point of view, one fewer address that genuinely needed a 15-year-old on a bantam to deliver news that could not wait. In 1945, at the peak of wartime demand, The post office carried some 63 million telegrams in a single year. By 1981, the year before the service ended, that figure had fallen to around 2 million. British Telecom, which had taken over the telegraph service from the post office in October 1981, announced that same month that the inland telegram would be discontinued, and the last ordinary telegram in Britain was delivered on the 1st of October, 1982, 112 years after the post office had first taken the service over from the railway companies in 1870. A replacement service, the telemessage, dictated by phone, sent by first-class post, guaranteed to arrive the next day, took its place, and never carried quite the same weight because it was not, in any sense, a knock arriving faster than the ordinary post. It was simply a slightly faster letter. Tommy Vale moved up from messenger to postman in 1948, the year he turned 19, and served the rest of a long career on foot and bicycle rounds around Bradford before retiring in 1988. The Redferns, at number 11, Undercliff Terrace, got their first telephone in 1958. Corporal Walter Redfern came home from Italy in 1945, and what the telegram Tommy carried to their door on the 4th of March, 1944, had actually said, Tommy never learned, and the record does not preserve. Only that Mrs. Redfern had, by the time he reached his bicycle, already begun to cry, and that whichever kind of telegram it had been, she did not close the door before he had gone some way back down the path. The inland telegram service ended at 1 minute before midnight on the 1st of October, 1982. Tommy Vale was 53 years old, still on his Bradford round the day it happened. He did not deliver a telegram that day. There were none left to deliver. What the telegram had done, for over a century, was arrive faster than any household could prepare for it. Good news and bad news alike, carried by a boy or a girl on a bicycle, timed at 2 minutes a telegram, uniformed under a rulebook nearly as old as the service itself. The telephone did not ask anyone to wait at a window for it, or to read a stranger's face on the doorstep for a clue to what he was carrying. It just rang. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Royal Mail carried and what it meant to the people who received it, subscribe. There are more rounds, more sorting offices, more letters from active service, more emigrant envelopes that arrived at a door where someone had been going to the window every time a red van turned into the street. Even now, most of us know the specific dread of an unexpected knock arriving faster than the ordinary post. That feeling did not start with the telephone. It started with the boy on the bicycle. And if you have a telegram, or remember one arriving, put it in the comments. If you remember a telegram arriving at your family's door, good news or bad, or if you ever waited behind a curtain to see whether the messenger's bicycle turned in at your gate, tell us what you remember about the moment before it was opened. Next, the returned letter branch, where the post office kept every letter that had nowhere left to go.